This video will be about mastering and more precisely about how you can set up some rec inside Ableton that always immediately gives you some satisfying results, especially if you're a beginner. It's not meant to be the once and for all solution because you always need to be open for making individual adjustments based on the song, but it just simplifies the process because by using a rec you can pick the 16 most important controls and focus on those and repeat the process with those a couple of times without getting unnecessarily stuck with too many individual plugins. The first thing that is really important is to have some gain control, because when we're using some rec and some sort of template, especially with some dynamic processors like compressors, we need to send in the signal with some consistent volume, because if you have some mix that is really quiet, your rec is going to react really differently compared to a mix that is really loud. So before actually activating the rec, I would just play the mix and then you check what your kind of maximum peaks are or where you are. And then you use the gain to compensate. So you once have to decide that you always want to send in your signal with maybe around like -6, -7 dB. And this is what you should always check first. It doesn't have to be like super accurate, but just to make sure you're kind of in the right direction in terms of gain. Then you can find the audio rec under Utilities and under Audio Effect Rec. And then you can basically load in all your effects that you'd like to use. So for this video, I'm only going to use stock plugins, so it's working for any of you, no matter what you have. But we know that you can just replace any of those stock plugins with some other plugins that you prefer, and I usually also do the same. And in this case, you could, for example, use some EQ and EQ8, just drop it inside the Audio Effect Rec. Now, the first preset of the stock EQ is actually quite good for what we want to do because we need 4 bands, and you can open the macro menu here. And basically what I did is having a low shelf filter like this for the bass frequencies, a high shelf for the high frequencies or the air to make it sound more professional, and 2 mid bands. You can call them like lower mids and upper mids. And it's really easy to assign those to the macros. So you would just click on one. And I think I had first the frequency and then basically the gain. So you can click on the frequency of the first one, map to macro 1, and also the gain, map to macro 2. And then you have it here, and then you can just click Command and R for giving it a better name, like bass EQ band or something. And if you right click on the macro, you can also select any type of color. And that's basically what you can do. And as I mentioned, I did it for all those 4 individual bands. So in the end, it looks like this upper row here. And I can show to you the EQ that here with those adjustments, later it will just look like this, but it's the same type of bands. Now, there's some super important thing about how much you can boost, because usually with EQs you can boost up to 12 dB, 15 dB, even more. And while during mixing or sound design, this can be working sometimes, in mastering it's a clear sign that something's wrong, because it should be about little moves that you make for polishing the music. And you can control yourself here by clicking on Map and setting ranges, because you can see, for example, here for the low shelf, unfortunately the order is a little different because I think it's alphabetically. Actually, this low EQ is the thing, I should call it low EQ gain, but also naming stuff is kind of some art in itself. So you see that I limit myself to -3 and 3 dB, so I can either take things down by 3 dB or boost things by 3 dB, but not more. And I really like doing that in order to make sure I'm not getting kind of off track, and also force myself to hear those things within small ranges. Because sometimes, especially if you're starting, you always do extreme boosts because otherwise you feel like you can't hear the stuff. And I think this is a great thing on how you can train your ears for also hearing those smaller moves. And if you feel like, okay, I really want to boost more, you know, okay, I should actually go back to the mix and fix it there, or contact the person who was mixing that something should be improved about the mix. And you need to find out what works for you. So if you're a beginner, you might want to put them to maybe 6 so you can hear stuff a little more clearly. But it's important that this is around, because usually by default it's at -15 and 15, and that's a very, very large range for mastering. Next we're going to look at compression, and compression on the master bus is also kind of some art in itself, and especially as a beginner you should be careful because it's absolutely a place where you can destroy things. And also with stock compressors, I feel like you should be careful in how much you do with them and how you set them up, because I prefer to have two compressors that do a little compared to one compressor that does a lot. And in this case, you see I have two compressors, and one of them is having like some very short attack and a very quick release. I also use quite a hard knee and a very low ratio, like 1.5 or 4.7 in this case, just for controlling the peaks a little. I feel like it gives a very, very pleasant gluing touch without destroying the transients, not yet. And I just use it for taking off like 1 or actually almost never more than 1 dB, maybe 1.5 sometimes. And you should try it, because if I set the ratio too high, I always feel like it's way too intense, but here it kind of has a sweet spot where I feel like it's some pleasant type of compression. And then the second one is having even some lower ratio. This is more like some mastering type compressor that has a slow attack and a slow release, and just basically gives this kind of mastering polish to the sound. And again, this will also take away like maybe 1 dB, and it has a softer knee, which means the compression is happening more gradually. By the way, if you enjoyed this video and also feel like supporting the channel a little, you can take a quick second and click the like button. Thanks. And as you can see, I was mapping the threshold, like the one here, where you tell the compressor at what point it should start working, and the makeup gain to the macros, because it also has some auto gain function, but I always feel like it's not properly working, or it basically makes everything way louder than it should be. So I rather control it myself. And also the range again is, I think, 3 dB. So let's check it. So you can see for the output gain, it's between -3 and 3, and for the threshold between -10 and -25, which seems more. But because our ratio is so low, it doesn't really happen that we go to some area where we take off more than 3 dB of gain reduction, which is also something that I feel like should be the case in mastering. And if it's more, I usually think it doesn't work unless it's some very particular case. But yeah, like this, it works nicely for me, but always remember that you can adjust this to your own kind of needs and what you find out after doing mastering for yourself a couple of times. And for both compressors, it's the same. So it's threshold and gain, and again, threshold and gain, and I called them compressor 1 and 2. You can give them some more creative names if you feel like. And next would be something for the color, so some saturation, for example. And in Ableton, it could be this dynamic tube plugin or the saturator, but maybe you have some third-party plugin you like, some tape emulation, some kind of preamp, those kinds of things for just adding this ominous character and warmth to your music. And here I really like to map the dry-wet knob, because often if I use it with 100%, it might be even a little too distorted, but it's nice to get the character, but just a little, so that you can control it with the knob here. And usually there's also some knob for drive, like how much you want to distort, and that's also a great one to have here. And just with those two ones, you can usually find a nice setting where you get some warmth to your music. Now we come to the final stage, which is setting a limiter, so you make sure your audio doesn't distort, but you also use up all the range that you have inside your stereo file. And usually it's fine to also clip off some peaks. So when this happens, you see this kind of yellow thing move here, like this. And one thing that is really important is that you compare it to your signal without the limiting, because usually you increase the gain and then it's loud and you're like, ooh, wow, yeah, so amazing, so loud. But sometimes you then don't listen exactly to what happens to your audio. So there are some other limiters, like for example, I'm using the FabFilter one, where you can just click a button and then it automatically adjusts the gain so you can directly compare and you don't fall into this trap. The Ableton stock limiter doesn't have it, but there's a nice workaround, because here you can see I have some other gain plugin. So I mapped the gain of the limiter to this final gain macro, and I also mapped the gain of this utility plugin to the final gain macro, but the other way around. You can see it inside those macros. So let's see, where are they? So final gain. So you see the limiter, we have a range. Actually here I didn't set any range because it also depends here, and you see this yellow thing, so here it's fine. And you see the gain is the other way around. So the minimum is actually 24 and the maximum is, in this case, minus 25. And you can also see it here. When I increase the gain, we decrease the gain of this utility thing. And this way we always keep the same kind of volume. So in this case, if we increase the gain a lot and completely destroy our audio, you see that it distorts and you don't get fooled by this being super loud, although here I feel like you would probably realize that it doesn't sound so great. And here you also see that actually you're limiting it so much that your signal becomes more quiet because you're pushing everything down all the time. But this is a nice little trick to make sure you're not fooling yourself by volume, because this is like mistake number one when it comes to any type of audio processing. And also for this limiter, I like to unlink those left-right channels, so we kind of treat them independently. Then usually for streaming, -1 is fine. Or if you, for any general purpose, I always like to leave a little bit of headroom. For CD, you would pick -0.3. Some people just don't do it. Maybe it's also fine, but I like to have it at -1. And also here, I feel like with the stock limiter, auto-release is usually fine, because it's not going to be like the most unique ever mastering setting, but this is supposed to be something that works. And the most important thing is that you check that if you use a limiter, that you do it to the amount or to the extent where your audio still sounds good. And speaking about this kind of fooling yourself with the volume, there's one more utility instance here for some general gain, because there's always a chance when you make adjustments here, and although you try to compensate for gain, maybe your signal is going to be a little louder with the effect rack compared to like your dry signal. So if you realize that, actually let's check here. Yeah, you see, here I have it at -1.38, and it works like this because if it would be at 0, you see, actually we got a bit louder. So I like to even this out so we don't fool ourselves. Sometimes it's not louder in dB, but just louder in perceived volume because the frequencies are just more direct and a little brighter, for example. But I like to do it in a way that I just trust my ears on what kind of the similar volume is, so I can decide whether I like version A or B more. But again, most important thing, don't fool yourself into not matching volumes. And there are way more things you can do, but those are the things that you can nicely map to a rack, because the more individual steps would be to do some surgical EQ to find some maybe annoying resonances somewhere, or to also use some multiband processing or some mid-side EQ. But here you always have to be more specific also about where you want to do it, and it's difficult to put this into a rack. And you should do it in addition to having this rack, but it just helps you for making like the basic body of the music. Again, just find out what kind of settings you change the most and assign them to those macros, because this is just like some idea of how you can do it, but there's absolutely no formula what kind of settings are the most important for you. You just have to master a few tracks and find out what feels good for you. But if you feel like having this one, you can download it for free. There's a link down below in the description, and maybe start with it and then over time adjust it to your specific plugins or needs. If you're also looking for some more creative content about making music, for example in Ableton Live, there's a playlist here with lots of videos. And you're also warmly invited to check out my online classes, links down below in the description as well. And apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye.